so much about you, and not just Google, but other giant businesses such as Microsoft and Apple. Some examples of what Google happens to know about you are things that you like. If you happen to be browsing the internet, you might notice there are web apps that happen to relate to what you like. If you're a girl and you look up a bunch of dresses, you might notice that, and they're there. And you'll get ads for dresses or maybe JCPenney or whatever. They know what videos you like. They'll start suggesting you videos on YouTube or wherever else you happen to be looking for videos that you should watch, based off of what you've watched in the past. Also, they know things like where your car is parked, where your house is, and where your work is. These I all know because I myself have an Android phone which has location enabled purposefully to test and see what they knew. And just from looking at where the places you've been going and how long you stay there, it knows that I go to school here at this campus, it knows that I work at Publix in Crestview, and it knows where I live, which I'm not going to tell you my address. So, hello, my name is Nathan Smith, and today I'd like to talk to you about not only how Google knows that, but what I did for my capstone, which was creating a database, which also happens to be what Google does. So Google has a very large database of everyone that uses it, so if you make an account on Google, and even if you don't, they probably have information saved of you in a database that they can go into and they can ask it information like, hey, what's Nathan's favorite video to watch? Or, hey, where does Nathan work? And they can look that up as much as they want. It's super easy for them. And it doesn't break any sort of privacy laws because you're giving them the information. So, how does all of this relate to me? Well, much like Google, that's what I did my capstone on, is I created a database, and I made my database able to be logged into, and also I made a form of encryption that I used to encrypt passwords that people logged in with. This was because the way that I save all the information, people could just open the file, so I wanted to make sure that if someone did happen to open the file, they wouldn't be able to read anything, which is why I encrypt all the passwords and all the information. So, how did I do it? Well, I used 3 different things. One, Visual Basic. This is a programming language that is used by Microsoft and a bunch of larger companies to make a UI, which is a user interface. So this is like a window that you can physically see. It has images usually, has like a text box for login and password on mine. And I use it because I can use it to create this UI that people can use and they can use the program with, but also because Visual Basic has this super nifty feature that lets me actually take information put in and put it into an Excel sheet, which is really nice because I can then use an Excel sheet to hold all the information that I want in my database. And even better, Excel is so organized, I can actually call specific blocks in the sheet and get specific information that I'd like from them. So I can actually show you what that looks like. That's what the login window looks like for my program. It's very basic. I didn't spend a lot of time on making it look pretty because I had no intentions on doing that. It's very simple. It's just a login with a username and a password, and the username can be generated randomly by me if you needed one. So the second thing that I used to do this project is called Python. This is a second language. So I used 2 programming languages in this, and Python was the second one. And the reason I use Python is because as fun as it sounds to use a language that's just really meant for making visuals to actually encrypt passwords, I didn't feel like spending the 3 years on doing that. More or less, I also didn't want to spend the amount of time that Visual Basic would take actually running all the calculations. So I used a language called Python, which is a very math-heavy language, and it's very good at doing these fast calculations really fast. For example, I can use my form of encryption and encrypt an entire up to 10,000 words in less than a second. I can encrypt all of it really nicely and get a key for it later if I need to decrypt it, which it can also do in less than a second, which is nice. So that's the type of speed that I wanted, but I'm also using Python as my backend code. And you're probably wondering, what is a backend code? That's simple. That's the code that's running in the background that the user never sees, which also means that I have to have a front end. That's where Visual Basic comes in again. Visual Basic is my front end. This is the stuff that people will see. It usually doesn't do a lot of calculation. It's usually just there so that the user can see it and they can actually interact with your program, while the back end is doing everything else, from calculations to actually receiving the input that you put in and then using it however I want. And then the third thing that I used was a lot of research, because as some of you may have guessed, I didn't know how to program in both of these languages. I did know how to program somewhat in Python, and in fact I'd already partially made my encryption method in Python before, but Visual Basic was actually brand new to me. So I had to do a lot of research for that, and I had to do a lot of research on front end and back end and how they're supposed to be used and what they are used for, which is really interesting. So we move on to my paper, which is called Ease of Use. And the reason I call it Ease of Use is because my paper is about front end development and why it is so important to programs that we use. You've seen front end development, I can guarantee it. If any of you use Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or Amazon, right there is a picture of Facebook's login screen. That's actually their front end completely, which is called HTML and CSS is the programming made up to make that, which is what handles what you see on the page. So that's their front end. Their back end is doing all of the signing in to Facebook and getting all of your information from it. But the front end is what I wanted to talk about because of how important it is. Because if you couldn't see that, I guarantee you people would be way too lazy to try and figure out how to use a console to access Facebook. Not to mention it would be a bigger pain in the butt to read. So I also happen to do Visual Basic versus Python because Visual Basic is front end and Python is back end. They're completely different languages that aren't really meant to be compared to each other. But in my paper I do because I have to compare a front end language, its importance, to a back end. The back end is what makes the program work, but you need the front end for users to be able to use it. Moving on to what I've learned. So I learned the importance of planning ahead, because when you're making this sort of project, you don't just jump in and say, I'm going to program a database today and it'll be super easy. You can't do that. As much as you'd like to think that you can, there's a lot of different things that I remember going through my project that had I planned ahead, it would have been a lot easier. Like, I got into it, I made my encryption, I decided how I was going to do the database, and then I realized, wait a minute, how am I going to remember where I'm putting specific users? Like, I don't have anything that's telling the program to go to this block to grab this user. I'm just filling an Excel sheet. And the brute force way of doing it would be to read the entire Excel sheet. But what do you do when you have 100,000 users and you have a program reading 100,000 users to find one every time? So I had to figure out a solution for that. I also learned the importance of front-end code, which is why I wrote my paper again, because it is actually really important. If I didn't have Visual Basic doing what it's doing, trying to ask Python to do this would be extremely difficult. You would have a console that you logged into, so it would just be a black terminal with white text. And also, in order to save that information, Python can't access Excel. So it would be saving all of your information to a notepad document, which means if I wanted to grab anything, I'd have to remember the amount of spacing between things so I could actually specifically tell it to go to certain areas in the notepad. And that's not something that sounded fun to me. And also, Visual Basic is something that I learned, because like I said before, I'd never typed in this language before, and programming languages have different syntax, so Python is typed much differently than what Python is. However, after typing in it, I can say that Python is actually very similar to Visual Basic. Visual Basic just has a couple things that are a little bit different in the syntax, mostly because it is made for making visuals. Moving on, we have our learning stretches. I learned Visual Basic. This was a big learning stretch for me. I could not have made the program without it, so that had a lot of my research time in it. I also had to create a way to save logins, which is what I used Visual Basic for, which was the Excel sheet. So a lot of my learning stretches actually end up combining together, which is really nice. I had to create a unique encryption process because I did not want to use the standard encryption process, which is turn it into binary and then use two extremely large prime numbers and do a bunch of complicated math to get a final answer that's a specific amount of characters. Instead, I wanted to make my own, which meant that I also had to research how encryptions work and what makes a good encryption. Which, a good encryption, you should be able to encrypt something and then never be able to go back. Because if you can go backwards through the encryption, it's not very secure. Mine has a way of only going forwards, but if I want it to, I can make it go backwards. The reason I do that is so that I can encrypt the information and then decrypt it back, but in order to do that, I also encrypt a key that's used to decrypt it. So it's really convoluted, but in the end, it works out for me. I also had to learn how to make Visual Basic and Python talk. So this is something that I've sort of skimmed over so far, but Visual Basic and Python are two separate languages. They do not talk to each other. They were not ever programmed for Python to say, hey, Visual Basic, here's a variable, please use it. It doesn't work like that. Instead, I had to find something called an argument parser for Python, which allowed me to set up my Python program to actually be run from a console, so I could actually just call in sort of specific variables with a couple different arguments and tell it, hey, do this, do that, do this. So I could tell Visual Basic to just open up a console and type it all in for it. And then Python would, of course, do the rest of the calculations for it. And then Python could send it back by saving all the information to a notepad, and Visual Basic would read it and then delete the notepad. So that was pretty easy. So was it worth it to me? Yes. There were a couple struggles in the beginning with trying to get an advisor that would help me. And also, trying to learn both languages was pretty difficult. But in the end, I think it was worth it. I learned a lot. And through this, I've also learned that programming is something that I really would like to do because I actually really enjoyed it. And yeah, I had fun with this capstone project and I'm glad I did it. Thank you for listening. Are there any questions?